In this demonstration, we are going to learn about using Gulp to help automate the web production workflow. The first thing that I need to do is to navigate to my project folder. So I will navigate to the project folder. And as I do that, we will be then able to see that at this point I have put two files inside of this folder. One of these files is going to create the folder structure that we need for working on this project. And we could go through and create this folder structure manually by creating new folders, creating core documents, and getting those ready. But as we are trying to move into using automated processes, this is a perfect opportunity for taking advantage of using terminal, so pre-writing a script. So for here in Atom, we can see that a couple of commands have been prepared where directories are being created and then files are being added to those directories to get the project started. So we are creating a core index file, a starting Sass file, and a starting JavaScript file. We're also going to be creating the file that will be helping us in this automation process shortly, and that's our gulp file that we will need to use. So this document is called create-site-structure.sh. To run that inside of terminal, I type bash create-site-structure.sh. Now, while I'm typing something, I can hit the tab key to autocomplete if I know that I've typed enough that terminal is going to know what needs to happen next. So it will autocomplete the name of that file. Now, when I press enter, we will see over in Atom, and I will show in the project folder that all of these directories and files will be created with the push of a button. So now I have my development folder, my distribution folder, my gulp file, and inside of my development folder I will see there's the CSS folder, fonts, images, JSS, CSS, and the index file. All of these were created by running that one file. So it's a pretty easy way to get going when we are working on a project. So this is the first step of things that we are going to work on. Through the next part of this demonstration, there is a file that has been prepared that will allow us to initiate Node Package Manager and then install Gulp and all of the required dependencies that we need to go through our different automations for our workflow. But as we do this, we could run the file, it will do it all in one shot, and we'll be ready to go. But for the purposes of understanding how the process is working, instead of running this file which does it in one fell swoop, instead we are going to elect to do it manually, one item at a time, so that we can better see how the different processes work together and where the different dependencies lie. Because as you start working with Gulp, what you are going to realize is that you have so many different packages and plugins that people have created that you can really customize it in a way that works best for you. So looking at our script file, we'll see that the first item is npm node package manager init. So inside of terminal, I'm going to type that to now. With this, I enter it, and we will see that it's now going to walk us through creating our project. So it gives us an opportunity to name our project. So I will type in a name. We can leave the version, description, a super awesome gulp project. You can just leave the entry point. That is the gulp file, which we created that when we initiated all of our core documents. And we'll be adding to that file shortly. You can leave test and get empty, keywords empty, put my name for author. We can leave the license as is, or if I'm going open source, I could type in MIT. And now it shows me what this JSON file is going to look like. And if everything is good, the default option, if you just hit enter to go forward with it, is always going to be in parentheses. So if it all looks good, I hit yes. And now what we will see is that we now have added Node to our project file. The next thing that we want to do is to install gulp so that it's available to this project. So we will use the sudo command, that's our super user do something command, and if we don't do that, it will get most of the way through the installation process, and then we will need to do it all over again because it will fail out at the end and tell us we should run it as a super user with the sudo command. Now when we run the script from the file and run all of the different installs, we only have to type our password once. But when we will be doing these individually, you will have to type your password in every time you're doing a sudo command. And now at this point I have updated, so we can see that it installs a lot of different items as it puts that in. We now have a node modules folder. If you look at some examples of using gulp, it will show that it only adds maybe one folder inside of the node modules folder. It's a little bit different now. One of the more recent versions of Node, it now uses a flat hierarchy, so it no longer builds nested folders. So as we can see, we have all of the folders at the top level. That helps because it breaks dependencies between folders so that if one folder changes, it doesn't break something else. So it's a good thing, but when we look at it, it looks kind of ugly. The good part is we don't care that that folder is there. All we care about are what files will be in our distribution folder, which is the folder we will deploy to our server, and what files are in our development folder, and those are the files that we work on when we are creating our project. If I look at the package.json file, we will see that it now has dev dependencies on it, where during the previous view of the package.json file before we added gulp, it ended at license. Now we have our dependencies and we can see gulp has been added to that mix. And that happened when we used our save dev, so then that added it. It still is not accessible to us because we haven't added anything yet to our project. And what we do first to add it to our project is we say var gulp equals require, and now I say gulp inside of that. So that now is going to, in this gulp file, when we try to access gulp, that now gives us access to using it. With gulp added to our project, now I am going to create my first gulp method. And this is a good practice because it allows us to figure out how it works. And the general syntax that we use is gulp.task. So we're telling gulp we want to do something. And now when we put in this task, we give that particular task a name and then use an anonymous function that will then do something. So with this, I will just log out, hi, John. So I've created a gulp task in my gulp file. and I can access this by going into my console or into my terminal, so into bash, and I type gulp hello, and it will run this task. So we can see how that works by clicking over to terminal and type gulp hello. When I do that, it logs out the message, so it tells me what it ran. It gives me the message that happened and tells me how long it took for that to occur. So this is a good first step to figure out, okay, this is how things work. Now at this point, what I have done is I have gone in and pre-populated my SAS files. So I've put in some information in some SAS files. I have some fonts going on here that I'll be using. My CSS folder is currently empty. There's no CSS in it yet. We'll leave that open up so we can see when we run SAS how it's going to work. Because one of the first things we want to do with gulp is to enable SAS to let SAS run so that we can compile the SAS and see how it's working. Then we will compile SAS so it happens in the browser so we can see it live. And we will set up SAS to watch for that, so anytime we change our SAS file, it will update the CSS and live update the browser. And those features alone make developing with SAS a really useful process. Or I mean developing with gulp a really useful process, because it gives that live update functionality that we see when we use some of the different plugins with Atom, or if you've used brackets before where we can do the live code preview. It's that type of workflow that we can make happen, and it becomes really exciting to see that take place. Looking at my install nope gold script file, I will see the next item that I will be working with is I'm going to be installing gulp-sass. So to do that and to add it to my project, once again we over in bash we type in sudo npm install gulp-sass 2-save dev. And putting in the save dev adds it so that when we install it, it updates our JSON file so that it has all of the information so that gulp is able to run properly. Prompts me for a password, and then we watch it install. After the installation is complete, we will go over to the gulp file, and in the gulp file now I can do var sass is equal to require gulp sass. If when you're installing anything, if you get error messages and it tells you to rerun it with sudo because you forgot to do that, that's no big deal. Then you just rerun it with sudo and then everything will be fine and it will work. So that's important to keep in mind, is you don't need to, if you screw it up, it doesn't really come back to haunt you. It's not like, oh, I have to start over and redo my whole computer. It's just a simple, okay, this time I'll run it with sudo and then everything should work. So now to create our sass command, what we need to do is we need to then tell our, or create a gulp task to tell gulp what we want to have happen. So gulp task, and we'll call this command will be sass, and then once again create our anonymous function. And inside of this function, what we are going to do is say return gulp.source. And now the source we'll be pointing to is inside our development folder, inside the SCSS folder. And what we are going to be using here is, well, not X, it's 2 stars / star.scss. So what gulp does is it has a limited form of using what's called regular expressions that allows us to say, I want all files that correspond to the .scss file type that are in this folder to be run through this process. So it's a way of being able to say it's using the wildcard selection method that we sometimes use under CSS, but a slightly more advanced version that works here inside of gulp. Now, what gulp does as we do this, and there is no semicolon at the end of the line because technically this is one long line, but we break it into multiple lines to make it easier to read, so we're separating things with dots. So we're going to use what in SAS or in gulp is called piping. So every time we want to tell it to do something, then we say pipe. So we're creating all of these different pipes or pathways where we need things to take place. So now when I say pipe SAS, and it's the SAS method, it's going to use the gulp-sass plugin, and it's going to then process my SCSS to convert it to CSS. So that now does the conversion. Then what we need to do is we need another pipe statement, and now on this pipe statement we will tell gulp that our destination is going to be our development folder in our CSS. And when we do this, this now is going to allow us to send what we need to have happen to that folder. So we can call the command and watch this happen. After I've saved my gulp file, now notice in the CSS folder there are no CSS files yet. My SCSS file, we can see some content there. Inside of my styles file, what I will see is I've created a class called testing, and the only reason I'm doing this testing is I'm asking for a calculation. I'm saying percentage 5 divided by 2 or percentage 1 divided by 2. And then we can see we're also using SAS color variables as part of this file. And by doing this, when I run the SAS task, what I will be able to see happen is I will see the files occur here, and I will see changes so that the CSS will be rewritten as normal CSS instead of as SAS. Going back to my gulp, I can look at what is happening here. So this is telling me I'm going to convert it to CSS, and then I will deposit these new files in my CSS folder. Going over to terminal, type in gulp SAS. When I do that, it tells me what happened. I look up here, I can see now this styles file, testing is now as a percentage, width is now as a percentage, so it performed that calculation. The colors are no longer tied to variables, but have been hard-coded into my document. Something else that I can do now with gulp is I can tell gulp that I want to watch a particular activity. So I'm going to say watch my dev folder, my SAS folder, and then I will say any file that ends in SCSS. And with that, what I'm going to do is tell it to watch what happens in that folder after I have run the SAS command. So I can now save that. Now, if I go over to terminal and type in gulp-sass, we will see that it's running, but we haven't returned to the prompt. So it's still running continuously, waiting for things to happen. Now, if I look at my more styles document, I'm going to update that. But before I do that, I'll look at the CSS, and I'll see the CSS is at 0. Now if I switch over here and save this, switch over to that, and it automatically updated it to 10. So if I were to put that back, go up to 100 or 1000, Oh, not on the CSS. We don't care about that. We care about our SAS file. Now I save that, go over to my styles, and because I had opened it and tried to type it, wasn't sure what to do. But as long as I haven't made any changes to the CSS, so realistically, all of your changes should be occurring in your SAS file, not in the CSS file, because we will do all of our building from that. But we need the CSS file to be able to then see it in our browser, which is where we are going to go next, because we are going to have it watch for not just updating our SAS, but also if we update the HTML or the JavaScript to make this take place and be able to see it live updating inside the browser. But before we do that, one thing to point out is inside of terminal here, to stop this process so that we can get back and type in more commands, I hold down Control and hit C on the keyboard, and now that stops that process from continuing to run. Once again, looking in our install node gulp script file, we will see that browser sync is what we're going to need next. The remaining items on that list, though it looks long, are related to allowing us to build out our distribution folder and to deploy it to a FTP web server, which we will cover in the next installment. But right now we're going to learn how to integrate browser sync as a plugin that allows us to see live updates every time we save an HTML, a CSS, SCSS, or JavaScript file. So first, what I need to do, once again in terminal, is sudo npm install browser sync. Then we'll save it to dev, type in my password. And once we have completed the install, then we are going to add this var browser sync is equal to require browser-sync. Now, browser sync is not a gulp specific plugin. That is why we don't see the gulp browser sync option here. And we need to then create an instance. So we use the create method, which is part of browser sync. So we have access to that because we have completed our installation. Now, to get this working, we're no longer going to be using that watch statement per se. We will be integrating that into our browser sync option. But what we need to do now is to add in browser sync as a task. And once it's been added to a task, we need to tell browser sync to init. And then inside that init, we need to tell it what folder is going to be our distribution folder, and our base directory will be our dev folder. So we're now telling it that we want to use that development folder where the files are that we're working on, because then later on we will then run a command to populate our distribution folder with the contents of the dev folder, and then we will be able to deploy that to an online server. But first we have to get everything working locally. With the base directory configured, our next task is to tell gulp to watch, gulp task watch, and what we're going to be watching for is browser sync, and we're also going to be watching for SAS, because part of this is SAS has to update, where SAS needs to run through the SAS function. But when we update the HTML or update the CS or the JavaScript, those changes don't need to be compiled. We're just modifying the files themselves. That's why we don't have a separate 2JS folders and a separate folder for our HTML. We just will modify those files directly. Now, as we do this, then we're going to call a function. And the function that we are going to call is it will be gulp watch. So I already had a version of that here. Save some time, paste that in, and comment that. So we're going to tell browser sync to watch for it. But what we also are going to want to do to make this happen live, so every time I save my SAS file, it will process it, update in the CSS, and live update in my browser. And this is where it gets really fun. So we need to add in another pipe where we are now going to tell browser sync that we want on reload. We want to call a method, and this method that we're going to call is stream true. It's important not to put a semicolon after true, because if you do, then it breaks the code. It's out of habit, you will often put in the semicolon, and then it will give you error messages. So now if I save my gulp file and now go into terminal and type gulp watch, recognizing that watch is the task here that we have specified. So that is the task. So now type in gulp watch, it launches the server, and there is now my HTML, CSS, and images and fonts that have all been loaded. Now if I drop back over into Atom and take a look in my styles file here, if I were to say put in a 20 pixel padding and save that, except I believe it's being overridden somewhere else. And forgetting that I have that occurring in margin padding occurring in both style sheets. And that is one of the problems when you have multiple style sheets. But what I'm going to do is I'm just going to get rid of the margin and padding in this portion here, save that. We don't see any change, but now if I go over here and we're to put that in, we can see how it automatically updated live in the browser the moment I hit save. Now if I save it again, we're back to that point. If I go into my styles and decide that I want to change the color for my H1, currently the H1 is showing up in, I believe it's same color as the background, but if I choose color 5 and save that, we can see how it changed color, and if it's changing color in the SCSS file, that means it's also changing color in my CSS file, so we can see the color's been applied, and we saw it live update inside the browser, which is really cool. So to recap, when we're using gulp, we create tasks, and we give those tasks names. Those names we can then reference inside of terminal, and then those tasks will have some type of output. Multiple operations, as they're set up inside of task, we use pipe to connect them together. And in this case, on the SAS one, it's calling the SAS plugin to run the SAS method and then populate in the CSS folder, but then it's also piping and connecting browser sync and telling browser sync every time we update, we want to see that change happen. Now what I'm also going to do is work with this watch statement, and I'm going to not do just my SCSS, but I'm also going to modify it so that every time I change an HTML file, we want to tell browser sync to reload. Now, when we do this, we'll notice we didn't have to make a separate function for HTML, and we won't need one for JavaScript right now because they don't have to be compiled in the same way that Sass needs to then run our Sass task to do the compiling. Now we can also do the JavaScript files, so we'll just switch what folder we're watching, and then once again on JavaScript, JavaScript doesn't need to be compiled, it just needs to then tell it to reload. So now my HTML and JavaScript have been tied to that as well. So first let me go over and hit Control-C in terminal to close that out. Now I will type gulp watch once more, and now it's running inside the browser. And then this time we've seen how styles work. So what I will do is I am going to go into my index file, and if I want to, I'm going to just put it in H2, type the word welcome, save it, and we can see it automatically updated inside the browser. So I changed the HTML, it's updating. And it doesn't matter which HTML file because I am looking for any file. Wildcard is any file with the .html extension inside my dev folder will be updated through browser sync. And JavaScript is going to work in the same way, so that if I look at my JavaScript and look inside, I have a couple of different files here. So we can see that we have 3 files happening, and now I'm going to just go, this is the main file, var main file is equal to main file. So I've now saved out main.js. This file was empty before. Now if I go over into gulp, or into my browser, and now I can pull up under my elements, go into the head, and now we go into main.js, and if I open that in a new tab, we will see that it now did populate those contents. So I didn't refresh the page in the browser. All I did was save my change, and because Gulp is watching for any changes to JavaScript, HTML, or CSS or SCSS, it is going to keep updating it live for us inside of the browser. So Browser Sync is a really powerful plugin that allows you to develop and get a live preview of what you're doing, but in the browser, so it's a complete experience. And unlike brackets, when you pull up the DevTools inside of Chrome, it doesn't then turn off that preview. It doesn't break it. It allows it to keep functioning, which in my opinion makes it a better experience.